On my video where I talked about Western leaders claiming to stand in solidarity with gay and lesbian and queer people after the massacre that happened in Orlando, Florida, a couple of people have commented and have expanded a little bit on this idea that it's necessary sometimes to compromise, to be willing to overlook certain things when dealing with international politics and how that can be sometimes important, and that you can't go around bad-mouthing the leaders of other countries even if they have abhorrent human rights records and that sort of thing. And the one thing I would say about that, first of all, is they seem to have, many leaders of other countries and general populations have no problem bad-mouthing Western civilizations, peoples, and governments, for one. For another, as I mentioned in my video, I think it's possible to have a non-interventionist foreign policy, stand firm on your moral virtue, and just trade with other countries, have your corporations trading with their corporations, that sort of thing. But even if that argument is valid, I want to stress once again that you've lost the moral argument. You can't stand on the moral high ground if you're going to hobnob and praise people and ignore their human rights records and then claim to be about human rights yourself. This does not work. Empty platitudes, someone else said in a comment. Thank you for that. That was a word I was struggling to find. It's a problem with making videos, off the cuff sort of thing. I wanted to read you something. I think this is sort of more apologetics for this idea that you can have something like a United Nations human rights panel and have a country like Saudi Arabia, not only as a member on that panel, but even appointing certain members of Saudi Arabia to head key aspects of selecting people, for UN panels and that sort of thing. It's not that, I'll read you this article, it's not that you would assume that Saudi Arabia is going to bring the human rights panel down by doing things explicitly. It's what's implicit. If you know that your neighbor is beating his wife and then you invite to take him out bowling one night or something like that, and knowing all of that, there's some complicity in that, in not acknowledging what's going on and then sort of pretending that it doesn't exist. That's the problem. So let's read this article. So the reason I want to read this article is because I think it exemplifies this ability of people to do these mental gymnastics that allow them to ignore the human rights record of a country like Saudi Arabia. There are many other countries on the human rights panel as well that have similar egregious human rights records, and somehow make it okay to have Saudi Arabia on the panel and not be addressing vociferously, really, the human rights record of Saudi Arabia. I mean, I think the UN is probably a failed organization anyway. Certainly their human rights panel is. When it has as its one of its key statements this, if you go to the United Nations Human Rights webpage, Ban Ki-moon, UN Secretary General, said, and it's quoted in bold lettering on the front page of the website, all victims of human rights abuses should be able to look to the Human Rights Council as a forum and a springboard for action. Really, action. So my question would be, what action? As someone said again, empty platitudes, right? So here's the article. Earlier this week, media outlets began reporting that Faisal bin Hassan Trad, a representative from Saudi Arabia, of all places, had been appointed a major leadership position in the United Nations Human Rights Council. I repeat, someone from a country known for human rights abuses would now head up a panel for the Human Rights Council. The panel Trad would head up has a lot of power when it comes to choosing human rights appointees anywhere in the world where the UN has a mandate. The outrage was quick and harsh. You can understand why. After all, we're talking about a nation that has killed more than 100 people this year alone, most by beheading. This was 2015, I believe. Ali Mohammed al-Nimr also is set to be beheaded and crucified very soon. Crucified. Current year, the wife of Raif Badawi, who is currently awaiting his 1,000 lashes punishment for insulting Islam, even said that the appointment was, quote-unquote, a green light to start flogging him again. But in the past couple of days, we've received more information, here's where the apologetics comes, on what the United Nations was thinking. Oh, and I forgot. The title of this article is, The United Nations Defends Saudi Arabian Head of Human Rights Panel with Good Reason. Let's see what the good reason is. First of all, the appointment was made back in June. It only has caught the media's eye this week. Why that's important, I don't know. More importantly, as though that was important, the panel that Trad now heads up has 5 people, and he has as much power as any of them. Oh, good, so he's an equal. It's not like he could single-handedly damage human rights around the world. This is doublethink. He's already doing that, or at least his government is. Wow. This is the doublethink that allows people to pretend that they stand for human rights while simultaneously ignoring and having a statement like, this is a platform and a springboard for any human rights violation sufferers for action. My friend Michael Dodora, who works for the Center of Inquiry and is their representative to the UN, explained to me that this group doesn't have as much power as people think. Oh, good, so it's toothless. They mostly look at appointments for independent experts in various areas, probably not in Saudi Arabia, rank their top 3 with justification, and give their recommendations to the president of the Human Rights Council, who accepts or rejects the recommendation. The HRC then votes on the nominee, as though the human rights record of Trad himself would not influence his choices. Oh my goodness. If that's confusing, Dodora looked at what this panel has done since being head up by a Saudi and saw no reason to be worried. I have looked through the nominated independent experts and see no evidence that they are weaker on human rights due to Saudi involvement in the conservative group. They're weaker by default, having... In fact, one of the most recent recommendations by the group for the position of special rapporteur on cultural rights, wow, is the U.S.-based academic Karima Benoune. Take a look at her bio and her most recent book, or her articles on open democracy, or this piece in The Guardian. They're all hyperlinked. She's a fantastic nominee for the position. Tonight, in a rare move, the Office of the United Nations High Commission for Human Rights issued a statement clarifying all the misinformation that's out there. This is all misinformation. Over the past few days, a highly distorted narrative has been spreading on the role of Saudi Arabia in the consultative group. Clearly, it is patently untrue to suggest that any one ambassador has the authority to decide upon a candidate unilaterally. Fine. The ambassador of Saudi Arabia was nominated by the Asian group to serve on the consultative group from the 1st of January to the 31st of December this year, and assumed the chair on a rotating basis during part of the year. Who cares? The chairmanship does not entail any powers over and above the other 4 members, who this year come from Lithuania, Greece, Chile, and Algeria. The composition of this year's consultative group was made at the public meeting of this year, and the group has already submitted all 3 of its reports for 2015. It's not expected to meet again till next year. What's not being talked about is the tacit approval, to some degree, for the human rights events taking place in Saudi Arabia by appointing someone. Solidarity, my ass, right? Allyship, my ass. Human rights, my ass. The appointment of mandate holders is conducted in a transparent manner, following well-established rules and procedures. Blah blah blah. Okay, here's the conclusion made by this author. In short, there's nothing to be concerned about. It's laughable. Even if Trad represented anything we despise about, even if Trad represented everything we despise about Saudi Arabia, which he does, unless he's vocally in opposition to it, which I doubt, because he'd probably be at the bottom of somewhere, missing some body parts, or being lashed to death, or being crucified, or whatever, right? If he really spoke out against the policies of Saudi Arabia. I mean, the Saudi king's own daughters were fortunate that they were his daughters. I said, before he had a bad gender rights record, even with respect to his own daughters, they were probably lucky to be his own daughters. That's why they just got house arrest. Even if he represented everything we despise about Saudi Arabia, he has no ability to push those views on anyone else except all the people in his country, which is being ignored by the human rights panel that says it's a springboard for action for anyone who's been violated. What he does is transparent, and his opinions could easily be overridden by other members of his panel, but they won't be, right? It's still disturbing that Saudi Arabia and the United Nations appear together in any context. Well, that's the most truthful thing that this author has said. However, he follows it by saying, but at least in this situation, there's nothing to worry about. if the argument stands, if the argument is valid, that you must compromise, you must hold your tongue, you must be careful and delicate. We got to be delicate with world leaders, but we don't have to be delicate with the sufferers of human rights violations. I'm sorry, that's fucked. But if that argument holds, I'll calm myself down for a moment. If that argument holds that we should placate the most powerful people in the world at the expense of the least powerful in the world, I'm getting angry again, then you cannot claim allyship or solidarity with those weakest people in the world. That's the point. Even if that argument holds, which I don't think it does, if I know that my neighbor is beating his wife, I'm fucking intervening. But even if that argument holds, you cannot claim the moral high ground. They're worse than empty platitudes. I don't even know what to call them, actually. Violent empty platitudes, if we want to use the social justice warrior rhetoric that inaction is violence too. I don't know what it is. But these people do know what's actually going on. It's not like they don't know. They do know. There's a complicity in this empty platitude. And so in my original video where I talked about the empty platitudes, once again, thank you, of these Western leaders with regards to their allyship or their allegiance or their standing in solidarity with minority or oppressed people, I was mostly focused on Justin Trudeau, who said he had stood in solidarity with the LGBTQ2 community. Of course, he made sure he got all the alphabet soup in there that he could to make sure that he could virtue signal that he knows the lingo and the jingo. He recently tweeted out that he was pleased that Canada is once again has a seat on the UN panel for human rights. And all I want to say about that is, knowing what we know about some of the member states that are on the human rights panel that are not being analyzed and critiqued for their own human rights violations, and this whole issue with Saudi Arabia and all that, is we've got to start fooling ourselves, and we've got to stop listening to the platitudes of these leaders who would say these things. Who would, and even the arguments, I think, that we need to placate the most powerful people in the world at the expense of the least powerful people in the world and call ourselves virtuous in the slightest. How is that any better than a husband or a wife knowingly ignoring the fact that their spouse is abusing their children and just pretending that that's not happening to keep the peace in the house? That's not what virtuous people do. And what pisses me off is that people would claim to be virtuous and then other people virtue signaling by showing their solidarity with that leader. I mean, I've got lots of liberal-minded people around me who think Justin Trudeau is a sweetheart and a golden boy, and that he's virtuous, and that he's going to do the right thing for Canada, and that Canada's back on the international stage. Virtue stands against evil. And so if you're not going to stand against evil for your own niceties and being able to get along on the geopolitical stage, or even for oil or whatever, you don't get to claim the virtue. This is probably the angriest I've been in a YouTube video. And the reason is because when I hear about marginalized people, it's funny, you hear the virtue signaling all the time. But I wonder how many of these people actually put themselves in the position, actually empathize with the marginalized people, especially people who are violently marginalized and who have no escape. And when I put myself in the position of some of those people, I try to get a sense for the inescapability of it, for the lack of any hope. And we're going to supplant that with global niceties and putting things under the rug. I don't buy it. You got no virtue. I better stop. Thanks for watching.